Welcome back, lost travelers. Settle in close to whatever light you've got, a lamp, a candle, the glow of your phone screen. Tonight's road will get dark fast. If you're new here, do the usual thing. Like, subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to keep the nightmares on schedule. Pour something strong if that's your thing. Stay with me. This one is a long one, and it smells of burnt rubber and diesel and things that shouldn't be able to stand on 2 feet. I was 34 and still bad at keeping a house. My apartment was the kind of place that made you feel apologetic for entering it. A sagging couch covered with a duvet I never used. A lamp from a yard sale, bruised orange glass in a crooked shade, that I refused to replace because of the way it threw light in a particular, mercifully flattering angle. There was a half-assembled IKEA shelf leaning against the wall, instructions folded back where I'd given up and decided the leaning version had character. My wedding ring lay in the junk drawer under a stack of receipts from a year I still couldn't remember forgiving myself for. Sometimes I'd take it out, roll it between thumb and forefinger like a coin, and find excuses for keeping it there. I'll put it back, I'd tell myself, like a liar making a promise to a stranger. Work had been roofing for 14 years. You carried 40-pound bundles of shingles the same way you carried guilt, with a distracted focus and a sore back. The job paid in cash and weather-beaten calluses, and a kind of pragmatic certainty. If wind or time tore the roof, you fixed it. It made sense. It was honest in a way that relationship endings were not. After the divorce, I learned to sleep with the window cracked, even in March, when the Oklahoma cold tasted like pennies. It felt ridiculous, like a loophole against getting trapped in the apartment by my own thoughts. Maya was a break in the weather. She had a laugh that moved her whole body, not just her mouth, and she treated me like I was less of an unfinished project. We met at a diner off Route 33. No neon, just cheap laminate and a jukebox that didn't work. But it was perfect in the way small things can be when you have nothing to compare them to. We talked about nothing big, her work with the library, the little dog she kept threatening to adopt, my father, and eternal stubbornness. I told her about the ridge we had to repair on a farmhouse outside Guthrie, how the tar would set like glue in June, and she made a face like she was picturing me balancing on a roof like a fool. She reached across the table and touched my knuckle, and I liked that she reached. After the diner, she walked me to my car. It was the kind of night where the air sat heavy near the ground, and everything beyond the streetlights seemed to hide. We kissed once, clumsy, like two people agreeing on terms for another try. She insisted on walking me to the curb, even though we were only a block from my place.
"Don't be an idiot," she said, smiling, and the tenor of the joke softened the edges of me. I remember the smell of peppermint in her hair. She chewed gum when she was nervous, and the way my hands smelled of tar and motor oil. Ordinary things, ordinary and fragile. I drove home slow. The route I took cut through a stretch of county road that gathered the dark like a secret. No houses, just trees and the occasional barn sitting like a punctuation mark in the landscape. There's a stretch where the road narrows and the trees lean in on both sides until the world feels tunneled. Headlights carve a path. Everything beyond that is suggestion. My phone read 31% battery. I had a six-pack of doubt at the bottom of the passenger seat. Empty cans, receipts, a lint roller with the last roll stuck, and the ring in the junk drawer seemed farther away than ever. The first sign was smaller than a car and bigger than a deer. It stepped into my headlight like a thing that had rehearsed its timing. I saw it at the edge of vision, long limbs, a dark shape that moved wrong, not like an animal I could name. My first thought was some guy in a costume, some drunk tramp playing at being an idol of folklore. My next thought was that the obvious answer wouldn't have fit the feeling that dropped like a stone in the middle of my chest. I swerved. My hands jerked on the wheel. Tires complained. The world shrieked in that way steering wheels do when you ask them for help. There was a sound like a branch snapping, and then a bang. Metal on metal or metal on bone, I couldn't tell. And the car spun, then corrected, then spun again. I remember the gasp of the airbags, the rubber taste that flooded my mouth after impact, and a single, stupid thought. Get out. The creature hit the hood like a fist and slithered. It wasn't slipping. It ran its weight across the metal, something wet and thick smearing against the paint. For a second, I was outside of myself, cataloging. The smell of damp fur and old blood, the way its shoulders hunched, how long its fingers were, too long, and the eyes. Yellow, not reflecting like a deer's would, but flat and hard and human in their intelligence. Its jaw opened into an expanse of too many teeth. Then the engine died, and the cabin smelled like coolant and fear. I had a handgun in the glove box. I can't explain yet why I had it there. Months of living with the idea of risk makes you a collector of small precautions. I fumbled, everything in slow motion. The thing clawed the hood again as if testing, like a predator trying out a new sound. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it moved like someone trying very hard not to let a secret collapse. It was bent oddly at the hip, like a man wearing somebody else's history. The first shot was a mistake. My hand shook. The recoil hit my shoulder, and all the muscles in my neck went hot. Sound slammed me, an explosion of metal and a ringing that crowded the world.
For a stuttering second, the beast leapt back as if insulted rather than injured. Then it hit the windshield with a force that spiderwebbed glass into a blind, glittering cage. Its snout, I don't know what to call it, was dripping. I could taste copper. The taste of blood, I realized, and then I realized the blood was mine. My ear was filled with a sound like a broken tuning fork. I crawled out on instinct and almost tripped. The roadside was soft with mud, and everything smelled like wet fur and diesel. The creature stood over the crushed hood, and when it looked at me, something animal and furious wove into the intelligence in its eyes. It reared, long limbs made it seem taller than any human. It moved with absurd speed, all sinew and blunt force. And the next seconds were a collage of motion and sound. The car's horn screaming, my breath tearing, the recoil of another shot as I tried to keep it away from me. It came at me with the tire of a madness. I can't narrate the killing like a clean series of tactics. There was no plan. There was only reaction. I remember screaming because sound felt like something that could anchor me. Screams are strange currency in crisis. They'll make you feel alive, and alive is useful. I fired until my shoulder burned, and I lost track of how many bullets I'd emptied. At some point, I realized I had no idea what pattern of strikes would matter on something that was not neatly human. The shots alternated between making it stagger and making it angrier, as if the pain only fed it. I stopped keeping score between hurting it and being terrified. The arrival of the cruiser was cinematic in an awful, casual small-town way. Blue and red light strobed like a heartbeat against trees, cutting the night into discrete, illuminated frames. The officer's engine idled, footsteps crunched. 2 officers, a man and a younger woman, the man with a patient authority, and the woman with that kind of sharp focus you only get from someone on their first year who wants to learn the right way to do everything. They stepped out, weapons low at first, then raised when they saw the animal. "Sir, get back," the man, Rivas, commanded. His voice was a heavy thing, no nonsense. He moved like a man used to making people do what he said. The beast turned. It abandoned me like a thought discarded for something better. It whipped toward them with an almost celebratory speed, and whatever it hit first made a sound like paper and metal. Then there were voices. Klain, the rookie, yelling something clipped, professional. And then a wet sound and silence that dropped over everything. I remember running toward the cruiser because running felt like trying to push myself into the story of what was happening, to be an agent rather than a spectator. I reached the patrol and saw Officer Rivas on his knees, mouth open in a horror-twisted shape, and Klain was there on the ground.
There was blood, but the lights made it look unreal, too red, like a filter applied by a careless camera. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to hold them like children and say it was a joke. Officer Rivas had a hand pressed to his shoulder, and his eyes had a strange glazed distance, like someone who was reading someone else's life. Klain wasn't moving. Rivas was trying to get her to respond, voice thin. "Klain, Klein, come on." But the words were pulled out of him like a spectator at a show trying to be useful. The beast was circling, and no amount of shouting or gunfire seemed to make it care. It toyed with the shape of the cruiser like a cat with a mouse. In 5 heartbeats, it made a decision with violence. I did what I had to, because there was nothing else to do. I grabbed what I found, a shotgun from the cab of my truck. I'd kept it in there for raccoons, and returned to the road with my hands shaking so violently I thought I would drop it. The thing turned to me like it had only been waiting for the night to widen for sport. There was no reason behind its movements that I could make into a pattern. It was a force that liked to test bones for fun. The rest is compressed. I remember the first blast like a punch to the gut. The recoil shoved me back toward the pavement, and a fresh ringing took over my hearing. The air tasted like powder. The creature fell back, but the way it fell wasn't the same as a human's. It hit like something that had been greased. It rose again with a speed that felt unfair. I fired again. My vision tunneled. I fired until the shotgun's heat made my palms throb. Then there was a sound I will never unhear. A long, keening noise that changed pitch like a howl being torn apart. The thing finally dropped. It collapsed in a heap whose bulk made the ground tremble slightly. When it ceased moving, the night felt too quiet, like a room just after the power goes out. I stood there, chest burning, the shotgun vibrating in my hands, and laughed. It surprised me, sharp, jagged, involuntary. The laugh had the same shape as hysteria. I remember saying the word Jesus under my breath and being annoyed at myself because the night had not been a church for any deity. You do not get to pick who you swear to in a crisis. Minutes stretched into a suspended state where actions became lists. Call 911, check the officers, keep pressure on wounds if needed, get them to the ambulance. I dialed. The operator's voice was a soft, flat line of calm. 911, what's your emergency? She asked, like she waited all night for lives to make the hard choices for her. There's been an accident on County Road 17, I said. My voice sounded distant, like someone else's. 2 officers are down. An animal? No, I don't know. Someone help, please. They told me to stay back. My mind kept cracking against that instruction. Stay back with 2 officers bleeding on the blacktop while whatever I'd shot lay hissing in the ditch? The logic didn't sit right. They got to us quick. EMTs and backup poured like a spill across the shoulder.
The scene became procedural, and I was both fascinated and repelled by that transformation. Minds and bodies formed into teams with protocols. Someone asked me who I was. I told them. I felt faint, as if some internal fuse had been slowly burning down and finally reached a bright, stupid flame. Officer Rivas didn't die that night, though we all thought he might. He clung to the edges of life like someone refusing to let go of a ledge. Klain didn't make it. That was the sentence the coroner later gave me in an interrogation room where fluorescent lights flattened every corner. She never moved again. The memory of her name was a weight that pooled beneath my sternum. The press would later call her a rookie, a brave officer. In that moment, she was a shrieking absence in the place where someone should have been whole. The next hours were a blur of statements and photographs and people with clipboards writing with the sort of legal calm that made real horrors look like paperwork. They took my gun. They took it gently, like keeping a live thing from causing further harm. They took my phone and backed up its contents. They wrote down the time of every breath I took, as if breath times could be evidence. The 911 call would be transcribed. My voice sounded steadier in the transcript than I remembered feeling. Later, in the station, they read from reports. Rivas was given a commendation for bravery, which was difficult to swallow, because brave felt like a word you glued on to the edges of a corpse to make sense. Officer Klain received a funeral that smelled of cheap coffee and pressed lilies. I sat through the service with other officers and saw world after world pass by. People kept looking at me as if I might be the character to understand everything. I didn't. I only had a list of sensory moments. The smell of wet fur, the way metal tasted in my mouth, the feel of the shotgun's recoil as if it had pressed some stamp into the inside of my skin. By dawn, the scene had been photographed, measured, and cordoned. There were crime scene markers, clear plastic tags, and a quiet that belonged to places after police tape had done its job. They towed my car. They put a tarp over the thing where it lay in the ditch. When they moved it, I insisted on watching, because I needed to see it with my own eyes that it had been killed. The tarp caught on a barbed wire fence and shook like something breathing under it. For a while after, people called it a wolf or a bear or a coyote with rabies. A local radio host called it a cryptid on his morning show and received a wave of listeners who had seen similar things and a wave of callers who wanted to believe. Rumor is a cone of light that magnifies the smallest detail until it's a lighthouse. Some of the headlines that week used the word Dogman in italics, as if adding a taxonomical punctuation to horror could make it respectable.
The internet did its job. Speculation, amateur photography, somebody insisting it was military, and somebody else insisting it was folklore. The investigators were good at being patient with wonder. They were less patient with truth. They wanted bones. They wanted DNA. The coroner's lab was thorough. They took tissue samples and ran what they could on the machines. They came back with reports that read like a negotiation. Part canine, part human, part fragmentation of cellular structure that shouldn't have been. The pathologist shrugged in that careful way and said something about anomalies and made a note. Weeks later, when a lab tech called with an unavailable-sounding tone, I woke up to the ringing of my phone and felt my skin pull tight as if every nerve was a string on an instrument being tuned.
There was an interview room where the walls had that same institutional green you see in bad dreams. Rivas was on the other side of a plexiglass partition, with a catheter taped to his arm, small, brave, bandaged. He slept in staccato intervals for a while, eyes closed, because something tender had been peeled away from him. He looked at me and didn't seem surprised I had killed the thing. He looked only mildly disappointed. You did what you had to, and it sounded like an absolution and a sentence. For months I told the story the way the city wanted to hear it. There was a crash, an animal attacked, 2 officers were hurt, I returned fire, the animal died. They took the narrative and filed it in neat boxes. But real life is a shape that resists packaging. Clayne's parents called me once, and their voice was thin and exhausted. They didn't ask for revenge or for money or for apologies. They wanted to know if she had been alone when she died. They wanted to know if she had been scared. I told them what I had seen, which is to say, the parts I could keep inside of me without tearing. The press camped out near my apartment for 2 days, as if my residence could be a shrine to survival. I had friends, but they came with the same wary distance people carry after a scream. You bring casseroles, or you bring silence, and either counts as kindness. Maya texted me less. She said she couldn't do funerals and hospitals. It was more than fair. My father showed up once, an old man with hands the color of tobacco, and he didn't hug me. He wiped his face with his sleeve and told me to get some sleep. I tried to sleep and woke up at all hours, certain I'd hear a thud on the porch or claws on the window. They asked me about motive, like you can ask that of an animal. Why would it attack? What had lured it? There were theories. Its mating season. It was rabid. It was an escaped experiment. Each theory rearranged the fear into something with a cause. But the eyes in my memory remained stubbornly awake and purposeful. They had looked back with a cognizance you do not see in rabid creatures.
It felt like someone who had been keeping a ledger and decided to collect. If there is a lesson to it, I couldn't name it. People wanted to know how I could look at that carcass and stand up afterward. The truth is more ordinary and crueler. Survival doesn't make you clean. It hands you a ledger and says, live with the numbers. I slept with a gun on the nightstand for a long time after. I laughed at things that weren't jokes. I woke up in the middle of the night and pressed my hands to the places that had been bruised by the recoil of the shotgun, feeling for proof that my body had been the thing that had done the killing. There was a stiffness in my thumb that came and went like a visiting relative. The town did an odd thing where it wanted closure but couldn't find a neat finish. The autopsy report was inconclusive on origin but definitive on damage. The city council held a short, polite meeting where someone suggested increasing night patrols and someone else suggested hiring a trapper. The trappers and the residents and the skeptics bickered like tectonic plates, sending small, jagged tremors through the community. In between it all, life kept being messy and ordinary. The diner still served coffee at 3 a.m., the roofs still sprung leaks in storms, and my landlord left a note about a new tenant moving into the upstairs apartment. The world didn't stop because we had seen something that made no sense. At odd times, the memory would unspool. I would see Clen's face, or the way Rivas had looked in the hospital with that quiet, protected grief, like a man trying to hold on to a memory that was not his to keep. I would be in the middle of replacing shingles in July when a bird would throw itself into the rafters, and I would freeze, hands on nail gun,
the sudden sense that something was watching me. Once, driving home, I saw 2 headlights in the ditch and pulled over, heart racing, and it was only a deer. The relief felt shameful, like gratitude for a thing that was nothing. People started to ask questions that weren't only about the creature. They wanted to know why I hadn't called before firing. They wanted to know if I had provoked it. They suggested I could have done more to help the officers. The questions were not all unkind. Some of them were the necessary scrubbing that comes after violent events, an attempt to find soft edges you can press a narrative into. But others felt like nails in the sole of my foot. The idea that I was in some way culpable grew its claws in the mouths of gossip and found purchase in the hands of lawyers. I hired a lawyer just to keep the curiosity at bay. He was a man with expensive shoes and sympathetic eyes who explained legalese like a bedtime story. There were nights when the laughter came back. It bubbled up like a bad habit. I would sit in my living room with the lamp on and laugh until tears came. It was nervousness and release braided together.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: It was nervousness and release braided together. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. No contexto de continuidade, a frase anterior era: It was nervousness and release braided together. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Thank you too. Sometimes it ended in sobs that felt like they might take my chest with them. The therapist I was assigned said the laughter was a defense mechanism, which felt like a diagnosis you'd expect to read on a muscle-bound clipboard. You did what you had to, she told me in the first session, and because the phrase had become a talisman for me, I repeated it as if it could be incantation. The world reduced stories into numbers, press mentions, radio calls, lab results. I stood at the center of an odd axis of belief and disbelief. People would come up to me at the hardware store and say, "You saw it?" as if simply asking would make me part of a club. They wanted to be safe, to step away from their own nights that might someday reveal a creature at the margin. Some were kind, some were monstrously small. There was a night that stays with me, the night months after when the leaves had already started to bruise into fall. I couldn't sleep and went for a drive, because night driving had a freight-like logic. You move through darkness, and maybe, if you are lucky, it will feel less like being stared at. The highway was open and long, and the radio played country songs that made me think about my father in a simple, sharp way. I must have been tired because I started seeing the thing in the lights around me. People leaning under awnings, the curve of a tree that looked like a silhouette. My hands went cold. My mind tried to turn what I knew into a wardrobe of ordinary fears. I pulled into the same stretch of County Road 17 where it had happened. My truck's engine whined like a small animal. The road was empty. I sat there for a long time, breathing, the dashboard light an obedient eye. In the distance, a train's horn blew, long and mournful, and the sound traveled like a conductor calling out. The train motif had become a private joke for me and Ravis after that night. "All aboard," he said once, voice dry, before the morphine hit some soft places in him. I've always thought of the train as a line you can choose to board or not, and I sat at the crossing like a man trying to decide which carriage to get on. I told no one how I kept going back. Maybe it's because some part of me wanted to make the world into a place with edges again, where suffering had a border you could mark and respect. Maybe it was that common human itch to check the wound and make sure it's still real. While I sat there, a raccoon darted across the road, and my reflex was visceral. My hands tightened on the wheel, my breathing quickened. But the animal passed harmlessly. I laughed bitterly at myself. The laugh was smaller now. It was a dry note. The town wanted closure stories, and closure stories are tidy. They like a beginning, a middle, and end, neat like boxed cereal. But my life after the night had seams. The creature's body had been captured and studied and cut into reports, and ultimately incinerated, or so the records claimed.
Did it hunt us because it could? Did it mistake us for something else? Did it think of us as trespassers in a place it had deemed its own? None of these questions had answers that didn't involve an empty echo. I survived what happened and left with the peculiar inheritance of a witness. Nights that were louder, friends who treated me with the distance of someone who has seen lightning, and a quiet knowledge that the world can harbor forms without names. I learned to look for light. I liked the lamp from the yard sale and kept it by the living room chair. It threw its orange disk of light across the room and made everything softer. I learned to put my ring back in the junk drawer sometimes. I learned to keep peppermint in the glove box, not because of dates, but because the smell made a small pocket of normal. The train whistle still made me jar, but I listened now for other things too. The soft croon of someone sleeping in a bed, the kettle's whistle, the neighbor's laugh drifting in through the cracked window. Most nights, when the house settled and the shadows pooled, I would remember how the animal had fallen and lay very still, because some part of me was afraid that if I moved, the memory might reassemble itself into motion. Sometimes, in the back of my mind, there lingered a shiver of suspicion that what had happened wasn't over. There are things that survive in stories, and there are things that survive in quiet towns. The difference between them is what people choose to remember. I didn't know what to call the feeling that coiled under my skin, guilt, maybe, or gratitude wrapped in shame. I knew these things spelled out differently when spoken aloud. "You did what you had to," Rivas had said, and for a while that was all I allowed myself. But there were hours when the sentence felt like a chain, an obligation to keep being the person who had fired back, to keep making choices under the weight of a night that would follow me like smoke. At some point, the host of a late-night show called me as part of a segment. He wanted to ask about the Dogman and whether I thought the town was safe. I gave him the plain answer I had given everyone. The town was as safe as any town gets. He thanked me and said something theatrical about monsters living in the spaces between farms and small, honest lives. I hung up and felt odd, as if participating in the story mediated the reality into a softer, marketable shape. There are nights when I still check the edges of my yard with a flashlight, ridiculous, small, futile rituals, but they make me feel less like a passenger. They give me tactile chores to hold against the abstract grief of loss. The world wanted cleanup, the tarp, the tests, the funeral, the reports. It wanted explanations in polite fonts. What it couldn't handle was the stubborn fact that something had been there,
had looked at me and had not been explainable by the categories we keep in our heads for nature.
The last time I drove down County Road 17, it wasn't because I needed to prove anything. I had a date toast with Maya months ago, a life that kept threading itself back into me in ways both tentative and brave. She and I exchanged messages now and then, the sort that edged toward friendship without trying to declare anything permanent. The world keeps inventing ways to keep going. When I pulled up to the spot, the ditch was quiet and autumn grass hugged the road like polite curtains. A fox watched me from the brush and then disappeared, like an apology. The north wind carried a train whistle, long and hollow, like a conductor's summoning. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the tree line that shared all the shapes of that night, and none of them. I sat for a long time and then drove home. You will want to know how to end a story like this. You will want a closure that clicks into place. The truth is that closure is a preference, not an obligation. I did what I had to. I paid my bills. I worked roofs until my back hurt. I tried, with mixed success, to be present for the days that insisted on happening, whether or not I was ready. Sometimes the mind is like a train. You can choose to board or watch pass. I learned to watch sometimes, and to get on sometimes. The thing I killed has been cataloged and debated and mythologized. The officers who didn't make it are remembered. Life goes on in small, insistently human ways. The landlord raising the rent, a neighbor adopting a dog, Maya moving an inch closer to being my friend again. When people ask me whether I believe in monsters, I tell them this: monsters are less the things that look monstrous, and more the meanings we shove into events so we can sleep. Whatever it was that walked on two legs in the dark, it changed a stretch of road and a life. It taught me how brittle the ordered world is. It taught me that a man can laugh at the wrong time and still be a man who holds on to his life. Stay with the light. Keep something burning. Keep the train whistle somewhere in memory, not as a horror, but as a reminder that you can always choose a track. We like stories with ends because ends make us safe. But sometimes the scar is the better teacher. All right, keep your hands where I can see them. If you're still here and that made you think, like, subscribe, and share this if you want the rest. There's more to the night than what I told you, and in time, maybe we'll unspool it again. For now, remember those ordinary things: the peppermint, the yard sale lamp, the ring in the junk drawer. They keep you anchored in a world where some things can still be explained. Some nights, the mind brings one small, perfect memory and holds it up like evidence. The clink of a spoon against a tin mug on a cold porch. The way a dog once nosed a palm and then folded itself against your shin, as if that were the only proof of loyalty required. I'll be standing shirtless on a ladder, reaching into a box of nails, and the event will come back as a picture of hands. The hands of a man I had known, now still, and then the hands I saw in the dark, long and wrong, sliding across a surface like a word I couldn't read. The similarity of hands becomes an echo I stumble over. I think about touch often. It is the most ordinary act of connection, and also the place where most violence begins. I try to be gentle with my own hands now. If nothing else, it keeps me from banging my elbow on things. At the hardware store, the clerk asks about the scar above my brow the first time he sees me without a hat. People notice it in quiet ways, a blink, a quick change of tone. Sometimes a child will point, unsophisticated in social rotary, and the parent will apologize as if anything needed apology other than the child's curiosity. Once, an old woman in line told me she had a nephew who'd fought in a way that bent his life inward. Men like that carry two sets of weather, she said. You learn to carry both. I told her I was working on the handier tools for carrying. I have nightmares, still, though they come less razor-edged than before. They are factual in the wrong ways. Train whistles with impossible harmonics, lights that don't cast shadows, a shape that lingers just beyond the reach of a flashlight and smells like wet iron. When I wake, my pillow tastes like the ash of something I have not yet remembered. The body keeps receipts for the things the mind forgets. I pay the debt with restless hands and a cup of bad coffee. The town had a memorial service for the officers. They put a folded flag in each family's hands, and a speaker read from a list that sounded like a ledger: name, rank, station. People clapped at the end, because we clap for endings even when endings aren't neat. I stood in the back and looked at the way grief traveled in columns and waves, at the faces creased with grief, and the young faces attempting to understand. A boy, maybe 12, held a flashlight like a talisman that city lights had not yet warmed. I thought about giving him the peppermint wrapper, but refrained. Not everything is ready to be shared. After the service, the sheriff came by, and we spoke like men who had to divide the day into tasks. He had a hand like a small tool, practical, calloused. He thanked me, which was the obvious thing to say, and then told me the department had decided on a plaque for the roadside, a simple marker to remind travelers that something had happened here, and perhaps to remind us we had been obliged to answer. I told him I thought the plaque was a good idea. Whatever the town did, it was useful because it created a shared shape for a grief that otherwise scattered. There are strange consolations. The landlord finally fixed the porch light that had been blinking for months, probably because the fixture's wiring had become shy.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era bubbly because the fixture's wiring had become shy. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. A neighbor brought over a pie she had burned at the edges and insisted it tasted fine if you didn't look too closely. Maya drove me once to the river because she said she wanted to see the tracks people had photographed. The river didn't offer answers. It only flowed, patient and indifferent. We stood on the bank and watched the current collect leaves like small, deliberate lies. "Do you ever think about moving?" she asked, then corrected herself. "Do you ever want to move?" I thought about leaving the town the way you think about changing the weather. You know it's possible. You may even plan for it. But the inertia of the familiar is heavier than any plan. "Maybe," I said. "But if I move, I'd have to take the shelf with me." She reached out and put her hand on my sleeve. "Promise me you'll make room for me," she said, half joking. "I'll make room for two things," I replied, "and maybe a lamp." There are nights when the edge of the yard looks like a declaration, and others when it looks like a question. A question requires an answer, even if the answer is only to keep living. The lamp sits on a small table by the back door. It casts a pool of light large enough to read in. Its shade is the color of old paper. When I switch it on, I feel like a person who has lit a small promise. Not a statement to the universe, but a private agreement with the day to come. People ask if I sleep better now. The honest answer is better in some ways, worse in others. Sleep is not a single competency. It is a negotiation between the body and the day. I sleep better when the roof is secure and the bills paid, and when I have anchored my hands into something physical. I sleep poorly when an unnameable question keeps nudging at my ribs like a persistent child. There is a man in town who now sells t-shirts with a stylized silhouette on them. He's capitalized on the event like a flea market prophet. Some people wear the shirts as badges of survival, others as ironic humor. I refuse to wear one. There is a difference between being part of a story and being a logo. You keep the memory without dressing it in consumer-friendly colors. You keep the ring in the drawer and the peppermint wrapper in the pocket. You keep a lamp lit. Once, in the dark hours just before dawn, I drove down County Road 17 again. I didn't stop. I just wanted to see the outline of the trees against a sky that was trying to decide whether to be purple or gray. The train blew its long, patient note. For a second, the air felt like something that might open. A fox crossed the road and did not look at me. The shape of the trees was as it always was, indifferent, waiting. I thought about how the world keeps being a geography of things we cannot fully instruct with language. That's the terrifying and generous bit of it. When I drove away, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ordinary. It is a kind of victory, I suppose, to arrive at ordinariness after extraordinary violence.